working, but we'll just see how we go. So I'm not sure if you can hear me, but I can hear you occasionally.
Hello, folks. Well, welcome back to World War II TV. We have a panel discussion coming your way. It is to acknowledge ANZAC Day. We have 4 or maybe 3 panelists because Phillip Bradley is dropping in and out because he's got a ropey internet connection day. He's on the road traveling and researching. And we're looking at the history of ANZAC Day. How has its significance changed over the years and what does it mean to our guests? So I'll bring them in now. We currently have 3. We may have 4 again in a minute, but so Rowan's in New Zealand, Hannah's in Australia, Phil's in London, and you all have some kind of connection with ANZAC Day. In Phil Craig's case, as a filmmaker, Rowan, just because you've grown up, family, traveling around the world. Hannah, you've worked with some youth stuff. So we've temporarily lost Phil Bradley. So for those who are not from Australia or New Zealand, who don't really understand what ANZAC Day is all about, Phil Craig, would you kind of kick us off with the basic history of it, just a very simple 2 lines?
Happily, Paul. Am I the only person hearing everything twice?
Have you got your YouTube on as well? No. You may have your window open.
That's gone.
Okay, so let's start with you then, Phil Craig. So what would you say is the basic history of ANZAC Day?
ANZAC Day is a very interesting choice of day to mark a major national celebration, commemoration. I mean, most of the famous ones that we talk about, certainly on this channel, will be celebrating the end of a war, a victory in a war, usually, the ED, VE Day, VJ Day, most famously. But of course, ANZAC Day marks the day of the landings, the first landings at Gallipoli of the Australian and New Zealand forces and the British and French forces in World War I, and that's famously not a victory. It's very much not a victory. It's already quite a complex moment to choose to focus on, to commemorate, and yet it has become an overwhelmingly important day, certainly to Australians and New Zealanders. And it's very complex because it's also about leadership and being part of the British Empire.
Yeah,
because it was infamously a bungled campaign, perhaps a campaign that never really stood a chance. So you've got themes of sacrifice, but also of bad leadership that happened to be largely British, and the sense that people in Australia and New Zealand, perhaps for the first time, at least that's the cliche, for the first time, began to think that there was something gone rather badly wrong with the management of the war, and perhaps with their own relationship, the subservient relationship to the British leaders. So right from the very beginning, it was a rather political and a rather divisive moment, and it still very much is, I think, for anybody who turns on Twitter on ANZAC Day in Australia.
Right. Well, let's bring Phil Bradley in as our resident historian. Phil's done lots of shows on World War II TV. So what would you say is the history of ANZAC Day, and have you felt it's changed over the years?
I think you've got to remember that when ANZAC Day took place originally, 1915, Australia had only been a Commonwealth for 15 years. So it was a proud moment for Australia to be contributing to, helping out our British forebears. And most of the Australians at that stage were of British descent. So that was the first time we fought in that way. So it became a very proud moment for Australia, and they just haven't forgotten about it. So I guess that's the main reason that it came about. Of course, we'd had units fighting in the Boer War previously with the British, but they were from the States before the States were federated. So that's the rationale behind it, and it just became a very proud moment. Our first, if you like, major contribution to the British Empire at that stage.
I mean, as a host of this channel with an international following, that even within the USA, some people get the ideas behind some of their days mixed up. There's Memorial Day, there's Veterans Day, there's we have a kind of remembrance period in November, and people who haven't necessarily got a direct connection to the wars have lost a bit of meaning of what that actually is meant to be significant, commemorating or acknowledging. And in Britain, we have Remembrance Sunday in November, and So the understanding what these words mean is very interesting. And, I'm coming up the 80th anniversary of D-Day. So people say, well, is it a commemoration? Is it a celebration? Is it acknowledgement? At what point does commemoration become remembrance? And these terms are very important. But let's turn to Hannah, because I think you're the youngest of the panel here by some margin, I would say. So what do you think is the significance of ANZAC Day to you, and how do you think it's changed from where you are? Because you've got a little background, you're Tasmanian, but you live in Australia. So what's your feeling about this?
I mean, ANZAC Day, I think, Phil, you said it perfectly. It really did set up who Australians were. No one really knew us. We were this brand new nation that hadn't really been seen too much on the world scene. And, that fight 8 months in Gallipoli, we really did show the world who we are. We showed the world how we fight. And I mean, okay, yeah, we're the underdog, but the qualities of endurance and courage, the humor, the mateship that we've got, it really did shine through. And I think it really did show the rest of the world who we are. And it really did set the scene for who we've become since then.
I love the way you use the word mateship there, because there's that speech by one of the Australian officers at New Guinea who uses mateship in his famous words there. And that's a concept that I think, if you're not Australian or British, mateship is possibly uniquely from that part of the world. So, Rohan, bring you in from New Zealand. Mateship and ANZAC Day, does that ring bells with you?
Oh, absolutely. It does indeed. And a lot of those issues and phrases ring true in New Zealand. A little bit different from our history in the respect that we kind of formed as a nation in 1840 with the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi to almost set up the country, and had our own parliament before the Australian National Parliament. So we kind of were there, and we contributed to the Boer War as a country, as a full nation. But definitely that dawning or awareness of New Zealand as a standalone entity, and almost breaking away from the tag of the loyal colony, certainly had its roots at ANZAC Day, and continued through that whole campaign and the First World War. Yeah, it's it does mirror Australia, but has its unique aspects to it as well. I've got personal connection with ANZAC Day with two of my great uncles from my mum's side, died on Chinook Bear, and their names are inscribed in the New Zealand Memorial there. So when I went there a few years ago, that was quite emotional to basically go up to the top of the hill and find your uncle's names inscribed there, and just and also finding out from the Turkish tour guides that were with my party, their aspects of their remembrance, and all of the different idiosyncrasies, and how history is written by the victor. Yeah. But in this respect, it's a little bit almost flipped on its head, that history of ANZAC Day is almost has been written globally by what you could say were the vanquished, the defeated parties.
Interesting point of view. So, Phil Craig, I'm going to bring you back in now, because you 9 years ago were working on a whole series of productions to commemorate the centenary of ANZAC Day, and you've lived in Australia. But as a Brit, taking on this project, did you kind of have any idea how potentially contentious it is in terms of what Australians and New Zealanders feel about it, and what was your remit for creating programs?
Well, it was quite funny, because one of the great ANZAC themes is gallant Australians and Kiwis being sent on uncertain missions by bad British leaders. And there I was, $10 million of your taxpayers' dollars. Thank you very much for the contribution, by the way, all of you. And given this massive responsibility to make shows, which not just about World War One. We touched on Vietnam, we touched on the Second World War as well. All aspects of ANZAC, and all aspects of the experience of the First World War as well, because it was not just a time of sending expeditionary forces abroad, there was incredible domestic turmoil in Australia at that time. Referenda, social protests. A lot of people were very opposed to the war. You mentioned earlier, Phil, that there were a lot of people of British descent in Australia. Well, that's true. There are also an awful lot of people of Irish descent in Australia.
Yeah.
And they were not necessarily going to be supportive, especially after 1916 and the Easter Rising in Dublin. So it was a time where Australia was certainly finding its feet and its voice and its personality, if you like, globally. But it was also a time of intense internal dispute. We wanted to capture all that in the shows we commissioned. And, you know, another thing within Australia that is quite contentious is indeed the ABC. We get a lot of stick from all sides of politics, but especially from the newspapers owned by Mr. Murdoch. Always keen to see us as a bunch of crazy lefties, which was quite amusing for anybody who actually knew me. I'm very much not that person, but I still got kicked by the likes of Gerard Henderson. I'm sure some of you on this call will know who he is. But we made shows that were praised by all sectors of the media and politics. I got lovely emails from Malcolm Turnbull, Andrew Bolt, who is a great critic of the ABC, said nice things. The lefty reviewers from the Sydney Morning Herald were pleased. I'm sure not all the shows worked perfectly, but it was very satisfying to me that we were able to capture all different aspects of this extraordinary experience and what it hopefully meant and still means to many young Australians. Talking to Hannah, though, one of the things that we thought was we had somebody, a journalist from the Fairfax group, Kate Orbison, and Kate went on one of those trips where young people go and it's to the dawn service at Gallipoli. And these apparently 15, 20 years ago, correct me if I'm wrong, were nothing like as popular. There's been a huge surge of interest in people of Hannah's generation in ANZAC, and nobody's quite sure why. Maybe it was the fact that the very last few survivors died off 20 years ago, but it is a phenomenal youth culture event now in Australia. And I don't know about New Zealand. It seems to be in Australia. I don't know if you'd agree, Hannah.
Well, let's bring Hannah in on that. Yeah, but I mean, what I read this morning just before Hannah comes in is that there was this kind of resurgence of significance of ANZAC Day sort of 10, 15 years ago, which may coincide with that, having gone through some iffy periods. But Hannah, what's your reaction to what Phil said there?
I 100% agree. I do feel that sort of over the years, the meaning and what the ANZAC stood for kind of has been lost as sort of those links to the older generations have fallen away. But I do feel that there are a lot more that are my age that are sort of getting behind the ANZACs and getting behind the history of Australia and Australia's what we've fought for, which is really good to see because it's who we are, and we do need to remember that, and we need to learn the lessons from those conflicts to be able to better serve in the future.
No, definitely. And so let's bring Phil Bradley in again there, because as the historian here, do you feel there are some specific moments in the history of ANZAC Day that are worth mentioning, or is it just been a general kind of morphing of what the day has meant over the years?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm currently working on a World War I book, actually, going through diaries of men from the war on the Western Front. So we're looking at the ANZAC days that took place 1 year, 2 years, 3 years after the original ANZAC Day. And to a man, they're commemorated. Everyone's mentioning it. And particularly in 1918, when on the night of 24th of April, that day the Germans had taken the town of Villers-Bretonneux, just east of Amiens, a critical position. And the Australians did a night counter-attack. So they attacked like at midnight on the 24th. So in the early hours of the 25th of April, they did a pincer attack and surrounded the town and therefore retook it. And the pride they had of doing that on ANZAC Day and the spirit it would have given them to do that attack was very noticeable in the diary entries. And on the other ANZAC days, 1917 and 1916, they were also noted what was going on, that was a day that was special. And then we go forward. I can't really put my finger on any from the Second World War, but in the Korean War, on the 24th of April, we call it Kapyong Day. So Kapyong was a battle north of Seoul during the Korean War, where Australian and a Canadian brigade held up the Chinese offensive. And so it's known as Kapyong Day. And again, The connection to ANZAC Day for the Australians was very prominent, and I'm sure had significance in how they fought that day as well. And you come right through to today, and there's a real in all the papers and all the media, there's an awareness of that we should be grateful to our veterans. So it's still a very special day in Australian history.
One question I didn't say I was going to ask, but I think I will now, is from a non-Australian New Zealand point of view, it seems good that you're combined into one day, because Americans, Brits, French, Dutch, we can all say, here's the contribution of that part of the world. But maybe it would be better served having separate days, because the Australian and New Zealand forces, although you did fight alongside each other in many wars and campaigns, you also had very separate identities and histories as well. So Rohan, as the only Kiwi here, better to be shared, acknowledged together, or kind of would you rather see it separated, or both somehow?
I would say it's still got really great resonance together. As Phil just mentioned, there's a plethora of other significant military days for New Zealand throughout our history. Very late in World War One, the New Zealand Expeditionary Force liberated the French town of Le Quesnoy, and that is starting to be recognised a lot more here. Throughout World War II, there's a lot of significant battles that we're commemorating and remembering the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Casino, which was a significant battle, especially for the New Zealand Māori Battalion. Very, very significant battle there, and the Malay conflict, Vietnam, Korea, right through East Timor. So there's a lot of history there, but I think my feeling is definitely combining it with Australia, because we were separate expeditionary forces, but we're thrown in together by the Brits, by the so-called people that knew what they were doing. So yeah, we were in it together, landing at ANZAC Cove together, and a lot of the history of that campaign, the two countries and the troops were interlinked. You read, my sister lives in Melbourne, I've been to a number of the war memorials there and the museums, and throughout that campaign, we've fought alongside each other on the same hills and the same gullies, and experienced the same things. So I don't think there is any appetite here in New Zealand for a separate New Zealand commemorative day for that. We're starting to remember a lot of the Maori land wars that happened in the 1800s here, and that's becoming more prevalent, and that's becoming taught a lot more. But in terms of a national day, ANZAC Day is it, absolutely. And one of your questions is around that. How has it changed? I've definitely seen that. I was a member of the Air Training Corps for 5 years through my high school and early university days from the early 1980s. And back then it was, literally we were less than 10 years out of Vietnam. And a lot of the scars and issues that came out from Vietnam were still fresh in people's minds. And ANZAC Day wasn't commemorated to the same extent. So, as a member of the Air Training Corps, we were expected to be at dawn service, and did that for a number of years. And the crowds were nowhere near as big and diverse as they are now. This morning, I was up at the Auckland Museum for a dawn service. Kids, babes in arms, right through to the oldest veteran and the relatives and the old elderly relatives of veterans, everyone in between. I living away. I was away for 21 years, Britain for a lot of that time, and coming back, I've definitely noticed a significant increase in the desire to commemorate, to remember, and especially, as Hannah's mentioned, of the people of that of the younger generations. So yeah, and probably put it down to two things: the centenary in 2015, and also the centenary of the armistice of the end of World War One. Two massive upshots or upticks in interest in remembrance, and which has flowed directly into ANZAC Day. Absolutely.
Thank you, Rowan. So let's bring Hannah in there. So the questions again here, together or separate, and what are your understandings of the changes over the years? And, you know, again, being the youngest person here, how are the young people viewing it?
I agree 100% with what Rowan said. I mean, if you're Australian or a New Zealander, you know there's that little bit of, you know, friendly rivalry between the two nations, you know, who came up with the Lamington or whatever it might be. But
Pavlova.
we do really love each other. Pavlova is another one, exactly. But we do, as two nations, we do really love one another. We're like siblings, you know, we were started at a very similar time in history. And we did fight those battles shoulder to shoulder and intermix between one another. And I think for a lot of people to separate the day and have two separate days, it would kind of detract from the meaning of ANZACs. But I do know that from my point of view, sort of the war wasn't really, our war history wasn't really something that was talked about in school. And then, as you said, Rowan, sort of the centenary came around and all of a sudden everyone was talking about it. Everyone sort of was like, oh, well, my great-grandfather and my great-great-uncle, and everyone was sharing their stories, and it sort of brought to life this new spirit, and it sort of reinvigorated everyone. Everyone was like, hold on a minute, you and me, we're the same. Our families all fought, you know, I lost someone, you lost someone, and it really did bring the nation together in a way. Because I sort of was pulled into the centenary, and I was an ANZAC ambassador for the centenary for one of the years there, and sort of just the understanding that brought, you know, we were meeting all of these veterans and we were talking at the dawn services, and these people that you're meeting, they have such incredible stories of survival. And if you just take the time to sit down and listen, the incredible things that you can learn, and the ability for us to be able to share that with peers, because they did bring in, you know, 17-year-olds to be the ambassadors. You know, they send us back to our schools, and we ran the dawn services or the services at our schools for the ANZAC Day. And you kind of have kids in your grade and younger kids coming up to you, asking you questions and getting really interested in the history. And it did really open the door. I do think it should be something that should be done a bit more than it was. You know, let's extend it more than just a centenary. Let's have a permanent youth ambassador for ANZAC, for our history, because it really does bridge that gap. You know, I can sit down with a war veteran and have a conversation with them, and I can go back and say to my peers, look, you can do this too. You can sit down and have this conversation. You can sit down and you can learn these stories, and you can feel connected to who you are and who your nation is. So I think in that way, the centenary of ANZAC really did sort of bring it back to the forefront of our minds, and it really did sort of spark a conversation that's kind of needed.
No, thank you very much. Brilliant words then. So Phil Craig, let's bring you in again. So what do you think of the various stages of changing attitudes to ANZAC Day? And as you know, as a Brit who's made programs about it and you've lived over there, what's your sort of assessment of kind of where we are now? Where's ANZAC Day now in the consciousness?
Well, actually, I think I was just listening to you, Hannah, made me think the mateship and the bonds between New Zealand and Australia, they are wonderful to witness on and off the sporting field. You know, but there's a terrific love between those two nations, and I'm sure ANZAC's at the heart of it. But there's another bond, which we haven't mentioned yet, which I also find remarkable, which is the bond between the young people who go over to these ceremonies in Turkey and the Turks themselves. Not many wars end with such a show. I mean, actually, really, quite a few. Not that many years after the war, there was a lot of warm feeling between Turkey and Australia and New Zealand. And Ataturk makes this very famous speech. In one of the clips I sent you, Sam Neill, the New Zealand actor, presented one of the programs that I commissioned, and he went to Anzac Cove, and he stood in front of the memorial there and read Ataturk's very, very moving words about, you sent your sons to our shore, and now they lie in our soil, and they are our sons too. It's a pretty generous thing to say about people who'd come to kind of kill you. But there was a sense, I think, in Turkey that this experience of sacrifice was the beginning of their new nation after the end of the Ottomans. And of course, for the ANZACs themselves, it was perhaps the beginning of a new kind of nationalism and sense of self-confidence. And that is a lovely bond to see. And I think you see that with the gatherings that happen every year. They seem to get bigger and bigger. There's a kind of brotherhood between former enemies, which is quite lovely.
That's a really good point. Phil, Phil Bradley, do you want to add on that?
Yeah, I might just give you some of my experience. I really like what Hannah said in regard to the what it means in Australia, but some of my experiences may sort of give you an idea of what it can mean and what it meant to me. Now, I first went to ANZAC Day when I was a little kid. My dad used to march in ANZAC Day, so Mum would take us, and I just remember the crowds, and I was only a little kid beneath all these legs trying to see what was going on, and just remember all these well-dressed men in suits and hats walking past, and suddenly my mother would say, "Oh, there's your dad," and you sort of look up and wouldn't have a clue where he is. But so that's what I remember from a young fellow. Then ANZAC Day, I mean, it was always there, but I never took much notice of it for many years until probably the 90s, when I went to New Guinea and had a job in New Guinea for 2 years, and was following up where my father had fought during the war. And at that stage, there was still a lot of veterans alive. So when I came back to Australia, I got in contact with a lot of them. And they said, "Oh, if you're coming on ANZAC Day into Sydney, come and march with us," which I thought was amazing, because these were guys who knew my father, because my father died when I was very young. So I was marching with them, and it just felt amazing, the camaraderie. To do that. Even one of his best mates still had his uniform, and he still fitted into his uniform, so he'd wear that marching on ANZAC Day. So I did that for a number of years, and it also gave me an opportunity to interview these guys and talk to them, and then whenever an ANZAC Day came up, wherever I was in Australia, I would go. Even this morning, I went to a little town called Bishano in Tasmania. It just happened to be the closest town to where I was camped, and there was just a small ANZAC Day, but it was special. And so when I used to go to these ones when the veterans were still around from World War II, I would talk to them and get their amazing stories. And a lot of them had fought in New Guinea, so their stories went into my books. And so it became quite special for me. And then only I think it was about 5 years ago, I actually marched with the 7th, because as the men got less, they would march as a brigade, a battalion first, then a brigade, then a division, because there was less and less of them. So I marched with the 7th Division, and I was able to carry the brigade flag, the flag at the front of the march, which was really special for me. So so ANZAC Day sort of, I guess it's, as time went on, it became more meaningful to me.
Well, thank you, Phil. And I was thinking of going down the rabbit hole of talking about, the poppy appeal in Britain and poppy politics, because that's been ever more in the news each year now. Does everybody have to wear a poppy? I've got a very good friend who chooses not to wear a poppy because he's Irish, and he just chooses to commemorate the wars in his own way, but doesn't wear a poppy. But we're not going to go down the poppy. We could do that in November. But the ANZAC Day becoming a kind of a political thing, has that been something that you've seen over your years of doing it? It should be about commemoration. It should be about the people who served. It should be about looking back at the past and looking at those who served. But has it got a kind of a sinister political side? I mean, Rohan, what is there a dark side of ANZAC Day?
I'm not seeing that or sensing that. Absolutely not. No. There's always going to be, especially in the era of social media, you're going to get your nutters, your Fruit Loops that go off the deep end. But no, not in the general population. Absolutely not. It's a day of reverence and remembrance and giving thanks for the sacrifice that has gone before you, that we can have a life. That Hannah and I are two members of two very lucky countries, and that luck was borne out by the blood that was shed by our forebears in far off distant lands, but not so distant. You talk about New Guinea.
Yeah.
Most of my war history research I did for my second novel was Second World War, where one of my great uncles he flew Catalinas in the South Pacific as well as being in Bomber Command in Europe. So he had 2 bites of the cherry in both theatres. But Port Moresby was surrounded, and if it wasn't for the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway, and who knows, New Guinea could have fallen, Norfolk Island next, New Zealand and or Australia next. So we have to as a nation and peoples keep remembering and acknowledging the sacrifice of the people that went before us, because we're living the life that we can because of that.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Rohan. I don't want to go down another rabbit hole of talking about the way that World War II history is shared, but one of the things on this channel has always been to remind our viewers that where the Australians and Americans are fighting in New Guinea, the Americans are fighting in Guadalcanal as well. It's all part of the same campaign. The Australians and New Zealanders who went to the Mediterranean are not going there to fight someone else's war. They are as well, but they're also protecting their own interests because there's trade and there's shipping and things like that. And it's all one big global conflict that sometimes gets a little bit lost in the my nation was doing this there, when in fact everybody was part of a kind of a global effort. But I want to bring you back in again, Hannah, because of this, the dark side, because I'm sure when you were a student there were some people, there's always someone trying to be a bit trendy, trying to be against what the government says. I don't wear this because did you ever see any of that? Do you see any of that, any kind of reaction to Anzac Day negatively?
You do always get the 1 or 2 crazy people, that's for sure. There's always someone that security kind of has to drag away in the background because they're trying to spout whatever their little madness is. But no, for the most part, I do think it's a day that kind of levels the playing field, no matter what your political, your religious, whatever your personal ideologies are. It is a day where everyone kind of is forced to put that aside and go, no, I'm here because someone died for me to be here. And regardless of what they thought, regardless of who they believed in or whatever it might be, they still gave their life in the end so that I could be here. And I think that's sober enough for most people that it does kind of rein in the crazy for the most part.
Well, thank you for that. I want to bring Phil Craig in again because, I said at the beginning of the show, I live in France. So in November, we have Armistice Day. We have VE Day, which is in the country of France is very important, but less so here in Normandy because D-Day is the big day here. It doesn't mean that they don't acknowledge VE Day as well, but D-Day has sort of maybe more local significance. But I like to think, as the host of this, that I spare a few moments to think about the losses on Anzac Day. I do it again on the anniversary of Verdun. I do it on Bastille Day because my adopted home is France. So I try and share my respect throughout the year. I don't just have that one day. Well, that's the day I'm going to think about losses. Phil Craig, I'm assuming you're going to agree with me. You think it's important for all of us, from whatever nation we come from, to remember not only our own nation's sacrifices, but those of everybody. And I suppose that's what you were doing with programming, is trying to get across to a wide audience.
Oh, very much so. Very much so. And, going back to that conversation we just had about people trying to pick holes in the Anzac tradition. There were people who wanted to talk about colonialism and empires and the failures and the mistakes and the cruelties of empire. And in some way, they think that's connected to Anzac. I'd say that's a slightly separate thing. But one thing that I found about a year ago, I was in Australia researching my current book, which is about the end of the Second World War. And I was very lucky enough to have lunch with Robin Pryor, who I think many of you will know.
Yeah, he's been on the channel, the great Robin Pryor, yeah.
So, a year ago, there I was by the River Torrens in Adelaide, having a lovely lunch with Robin. And we talked about this very thing, about people who want to sort of pick holes with the motivation of why people fought in all the wars, actually, in the 20th century. And there's just a line from Robin's book that I'd love to read, which I think sums up my feelings, actually, for all of the kind of mistakes and for all of the arguments that have happened in the decades that have followed. It's what Robin says. In the 20th century, it fell to Britain and the world that Britain led to confront a number of regimes which represented a threat to the civilized world. Taking these 2 world wars together, Britain was the only power on the Allied side to fight these regimes from the beginning to the end of both these wars. And given the nature of the powers it was fighting, it was essential to any chance of a liberal world order, however imperfect, emerging, that Britain and the nations that Britain led had to be on the winning side. Wow. That's why we study military history, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. So let's bring Phil Bradley again now, because we're kind of over halfway through the hour that I've dedicated this. Anything about what it still means to you? Anything you think about the changes? What do you think of the future is? Just kind of sum up where you are, and what does ANZAC Day mean to you?
Well, as I said, it's a day when I don't know. It's just great to see a lot of people out and about, and young people, older people, right through the just in all the little towns. As I say, today I went to a very little town. I've also been to a big city on ANZAC Day, and one I remember was actually 2 years. What's 24? Yeah, 2 years ago I was in Queensland near Bundaberg, and there's a little town outside Bundaberg, a coastal town called Barrett, and I was staying there in the caravan park, and I thought I'll get up and walk down to the dawn service, which is going to be right on so the sun rises over the ocean from the memorial, so you can watch the sunrise. And so I went down there, and I thought there might be a few other people down there. There was 1,500 people there. It was just incredible. And then to watch the sunrise over the ocean. So I think it means a lot to me to sort of see that. And then they were talking about the men who came ashore in the boats that morning on Gallipoli, the same sort of morning. So, and I think that'll never change. So, and I hope it never changes. And to see all the young people there, I hope they'll keep going and then take their children there and keep the memory. And it just happens to be that day. Okay, Gallipoli was a defeat, but and I like that about Australia, is that we can commemorate a defeat as our what became a defeat as our national day to remember our servicemen. So yeah,
thank you.
Still means a lot to me. Yeah.
Rohan, final thoughts or what it means to you?
Yeah, it will always have resonance for me, mainly due to probably the family connection to the actual campaign, and my two great uncles that died there, but also I had another great uncle, three brothers. One of them died at the Somme, and then on my dad's side, great uncle made it through World War I, but died in the early 1920s of complications from the First World War. And then I had two great uncles that fought in World War II. So, yeah, there's a lot of family connections. It will always be a big part of my life, and will continue to go to the dawn services. And as Phil just mentioned, just seeing all the generations really embracing it and taking it on board is fantastic to see. And Phil, Craig, you're dead right. Bringing Turkey into the conversation, we've always been taught here. It was the campaign was the birthplace or the birth time of three modern nations: Australia, New Zealand, and the modern Turkish nation. Absolutely. I stood in front of that memorial of Ataturk's words, and cried like a baby when I read them. Very moving. So, we're both our countries and our peoples are held in high regard in Turkey. It was quite amazing to see that and feel that from the Turkish people. So, yeah, a big part of my life going forward. Absolutely.
Thank you, Rohan. And Hannah?
Yeah, it really is a big part of my life. I mean, I think it always will be. I reckon I could live anywhere in the world and dawn service, even if it's just me and a little fire pit out the back, because it really is who we are as a nation. I mean, we've seen here this year in Victoria, there was a RSL, which is a return service league that's run here in Australia to help look after veterans. One of the RSL sub-branches here in Victoria burnt down about a week ago, which is really kind of sad timing for the dawn service. But they had one of the biggest dawn service turnouts that they've ever had. Like, it brings us together as a nation this one day. And I think for all of us, it really is something that we can be proud of, regardless of how people think it turned out or how people think it should have turned out. It is something that we can be proud of as a nation, and it is something that does bring us together for the good. So I'm here for it all the way.
Mm. It's interesting. There are some comments in there in the sidebar about the fact that is it an appropriate day to kind of level protest? Is it the day to kind of, express your doubts with government policy or and I'm not sure. Some people are saying yes, it is the perfect day to say that. That's what these people died for, is to give us the right to have a democracy. Other people say no, it's not the right day for it. So we'll perhaps leave that debate for a future conversation. But I think I want to kind of leave it with this idea that ANZAC Day shouldn't just be the day for people from Australia and New Zealand to commemorate what their countries did, but it should be for the rest of the world to also have a look at what Australia and New Zealand did. Because if you're an American watching this later on, because it's the wrong time of day for Americans, as I said earlier, the American successes in Guadalcanal and the eventual successes in the Pacific are largely rooted in the support they were getting from Australia and New Zealand. Just if nothing else, is massive, great transport hubs. The tens of thousands of Americans and New Zealanders who went through Americans who went through those two countries. All the New Zealand, Australian pilots who went over to Europe and fought with Bomber Command and Fighter Command. It was a global effort. So I think, we Australians and New Zealanders should remember the French sacrifice when their commemorations come around, and the British should remember the Australians. The Americans should acknowledge that. You know where I'm going with this, folks. It's a global war, and it's an opportunity for our country to look inwards, but also to look outwards as well. I think that's what I want to say. But Phil, Craig, any kind of final words from you?
I was just thinking about the famous jungle warfare school that was established in Queensland in the Second World War. I think that was seen as one of the most significant developments in learning how to fight in the jungle, based on the experiences and the successes that the Aussies had had in 42 and 43, where there weren't many successes against Japan then. And they spread that knowledge. They spread it to India, to Britain, and they spread it to America. And that was a wonderful example of that kind of global alliance in action. And a military that can learn and change. And come to think that the jungle isn't this terrifying alien force that is in some way allied to our enemies, who are kind of like these incredible super warriors who can live in the jungle and we can't. We can learn to live and fight in the jungle, and we can make them scared of it. Yeah, and that was actually, for the book I'm writing now about the end of the Second World War, a really important moment, I think. It definitely influenced what happened in Burma. The Australians weren't fighting in Burma, but Australian ideas were employed in Burma a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can argue that Montgomery's use of artillery is all learned from the New Zealand contribution in North Africa that taught the Brits how to do a stonk.
And we could talk about the 100 days at the end of the First World War, where the Australians and the Canadians lead the way with lots of new ideas.
It's just a bit of a slightly negative comment from Scott Grimwood, who's American. He's saying, has ANZAC Day been co-opted into just a day off and a time for a store sale? Because that's what happened to Memorial Day in the US. So that's the...
I mean, there is a bit of that. If you're in Australia, you see an awful lot of people like this wandering around.
I knew they were going to come out, Phil.
Was that you, Hannah, earlier, with a big flag?
Yeah.
I brought my stubby holder as well, Ned Kelly stubby holder. But there's a lot of that, because it's a national holiday and people like to get together with their mates.
But I mean, that's the big discussion we're going to have in Normandy for the 80th, and it happens for all the big anniversaries, as I said at the beginning, is when does commemoration become remembrance? When can you celebrate? I have no problem around June the 6th with there being liberation balls with Glenn Miller and Benny Goodman playing and people going out there and jitterbugging. I'm fine with that, but then there must also be the moment where you go to the cemetery and you pay your respects. It's as long as they don't kind of clash, those two events at the same time, it's fine. So a day off, if you understand the reasons for the day off, if in America on Memorial Day you do end up having a barbecue, I suppose that's fine, as long as you understand why it is you're allowed to have the barbecue. And I think that's where it comes down to the way the media shares these events, how we as citizens express to our friends and our families what the day means to us, so that we can say, okay, we are going to go and have a barbecue today, we are going to go to the beach, but here's the freedom we have to go to that beach. I think that's my kind of final. Anyone else want to say any final things before we switch off?
I do think what Phil said is right. I mean, yes, it can very easily become sort of a very marketed day, but I know I saw one comment there saying the glasses are for Australia Day, and they really are. sort of those more comical, humorous little gimmicks really are a bit more for Australia Day, which has become quite politically corrupted in a way. Where Anzac Day, I think there's still quite a lot of respect that goes around. Yep. You see a lot of people wearing sort of nicer clothing. You see people, if they're not military, they're just wearing a nice suit or sort of a bit more businessy attire. You know, people you see on the news, you've got the newsreaders have got a rosemary or a pin or something on their lapel. It really still does have that very underlying tone of respect where we do care enough and respect enough the sacrifice that was made that at the moment it hasn't become sort of that marketed day. If it was to go there, it would be quite sad. I hope it doesn't, but I guess only time can tell that one.
I mean, that's the future. We don't know what's going to hold, but I think ultimately we don't have to express our ways that we are grateful the same way. You know, I mean, it's look at how some funerals are big, joyous occasions where people remember the best of some. In other cases, they're very solemn and it's what the individual wants. It's what the group of people wants. You know, there's no set way to commemorate or acknowledge the past. It's what you feel comfortable with and how you want to express it. You know, we're back to the idea of in Britain of wearing a poppy or not wearing a poppy. Not wearing a poppy doesn't mean you don't care. It means that you care in a different way. And I think that's, as long as we have the right under democracies to express our opinions openly and not be hateful, I suppose that's the way to end it. But it's been an intriguing conversation. I look forward to touching on it again in November with some different points of view about remembrance. And but yeah, for those who around the world who didn't know much about Anzac Day, we've addressed it. So thank you very much, Phil and Rohan and Hannah. And folks, I'm back again later or tomorrow if you're in Australia, talking about the Machine Gun Corps Manchester Regiment in Normandy. I'll be back for that later on. But that right now, thanks very much for your fantastic comments and questions. I will see you all again next time. This is Paul Woodad for World War II TV saying cheers, everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Yeah.
All the best.